Hello again, and welcome to True Asian Nightmare. It's Kay here. If you're feeling weighed down by the endless rush of the day, it's finally time to put those heavy thoughts down. There's nothing left to figure out tonight. Just close your eyes, breathe out the worry, and allow the stillness of the night to surround you. If you enjoy drifting off to real paranormal encounters, gently tapping the like button and hitting subscribe helps the channel grow quietly. Plus, it ensures there will always be another nightmare waiting for you every other night. If you'd like to share what part of the world you're settling down in and the current hour on your end, there's always a warm corner in the comments. Knowing others are also finding rest in this exact same hour is a deeply comforting thought. Let's get comfortable, turn off the last of the lights, and quietly slip into tonight's true horror stories. When I first got to Bien Ho to do factory work, I was just this clueless 19-year-old kid, relying entirely on my aunt for survival. We had to move out suddenly because she had this massive blowout with the landlord, and she somehow managed to score a new room for just $60 a month. I really should have known the price was too good to be true, especially since it was located at the very dead end of an alley off Pho Tso Street, where the streetlights completely stopped, and the landscape turned into literal swamps and ancient power lines. I mean, I was just a young guy from the countryside trying to make a living, and the city was already overwhelming enough without having to deal with housing drama. The whole moving situation was an absolute logistical nightmare. Our old landlord told us we had to be completely out by the 30th of the month, but the new place wasn't technically ready for us to fully move into until a few days later. My aunt, being the incredibly practical and stubborn woman she was, decided we needed to split up. We had a couple of big-ticket items, mainly a heavy old television and a decent-sized refrigerator, and she was absolutely paranoid that if we moved them to the new empty room and just left them there, someone would definitely break in and steal them. So the brilliant plan was that I would take the fridge and the TV, load them onto a hired cart, and go stay at the new room by myself for 3 days to guard our stuff. I would also clean the place up while my aunt stayed behind at the old room to finish packing the rest of our junk. I didn't really have a choice in the matter, so I just agreed. That first night alone in the new place was just miserable. The room was basically a concrete box with a tin roof that trapped all the heat from the day. I didn't even have a mattress or a mosquito net yet, just a thin woven mat thrown right onto the raw floor. There was no fan, no AC, nothing. It was so suffocatingly hot that the air felt thick, and the only sounds were the frogs in the swamp outside and the occasional hum of those sketchy wooden power lines. I remember lying there in the dark, sweating through my shirt, just staring at the ceiling and waiting for sleep to finally take over. Eventually, I did fall asleep, but it brought this incredibly vivid and bizarre dream. In the dream, I was still just sitting in that exact same sweltering room. The heat was so unbearable that I decided to get up and leave the front door wide open to try and catch a breeze. I went back to sitting on the floor, eating a bowl of rice or something, when I noticed a group of people standing right outside my open door. There were 5 of them in total. 2 women and 3 men. They looked perfectly normal, just dressed in cheap everyday factory clothes, with the guys wearing faded button-down shirts completely untucked over their old slacks, like folks who had been working hard labor their whole lives. They were just standing there, in the dirt alley, having a conversation among themselves, but they were positioned right in front of my doorway. I didn't really care at first, figuring the alley was narrow and people needed space to talk, so I just kept eating my food and casually listening in. But then I realized they were talking about me. I could hear their voices clearly, and they sounded super annoyed. They were complaining to each other about how this new kid who just moved in had zero respect and didn't know any of the unwritten rules. They were muttering about how I was too cheap to go out to the market and spend a few bucks on some basic offerings, or even light a single stick of incense for them. I felt this spike of defensiveness in the dream and actually stood up, walking toward the door to ask them what their problem was and why they were gossiping about me right outside my own house. But before I could even cross the threshold, the older woman in the group, who seemed slightly calmer than the rest, held up her hand and gave me this dead, hollow stare, Don't come any closer. You step out here, you get sick. And that is on you." The way she said it was so chilling and absolute that I physically froze in my tracks. I just stood there, completely confused, watching them continue to whisper and complain about me not giving them anything to eat. I woke up the next morning feeling incredibly groggy, looking around the empty room and just brushing it off as a weird stress dream brought on by the crazy heat in the new environment. I got ready for my factory shift and honestly forgot all about it by the time I clocked in. Later that afternoon, after my shift ended, I hopped on my little scooter and stopped by the local open-air market to grab some groceries for dinner. I was just planning to buy a cheap fish, a small chunk of pork, and some veggies to braise so we'd have food for a couple of days. But as I was walking past a stall selling spiritual items, like joss paper, incense, and all those paper models people burn for the dead, I just stopped. I didn't even want to stop. It was like my feet suddenly weighed 100 pounds, and I found myself just standing there, staring blankly at the stacks of gold-painted paper and bundles of red incense. I must have stood there for a solid 2 minutes, completely zoning out, thinking about how my aunt usually handled all the spiritual stuff at the old place, and how I knew absolutely nothing about it. The vendor lady eventually snapped me out of it, yelling at me to buy something or get lost because I was bringing her bad luck by just standing there blocking her stall. I quickly apologized and moved away, grabbing my groceries from a different vendor. But then, as I was walking toward the exit of the market, I passed another spiritual supply stall, and it happened again. My feet just stopped. The noise of the busy market seemed to get muffled, and I swear I started hearing these incredibly faint, raspy whispers right next to my ear, telling me to just buy it. Buy anything. Just buy some incense and paper. Just buy it. It was creeping me out, and the vendor at this second stall was much friendlier. She asked me if I was moving into a new place or opening a business because I looked completely lost. I ended up telling her I just moved into a new rental and had no idea what I was doing. She immediately put together a whole package for me, tossing in some joss paper, a little salt, some rice, and a few bundles of incense. She told me it was basic manners to offer a little something to the wandering unseen guards of the land when you move somewhere new, just to keep things peaceful. She also specifically told me to go buy some nice fruits for the offering, like apples, pears, or pomegranates, and warned me to absolutely avoid cheap sour fruits like guavas or ambarellas because the dead see that as a huge insult. It only cost me a few bucks, so I paid her, grabbed the right fruits from the stand next door, and headed back to my empty room. When I got home, I set the plastic bags of offerings and fruit right on the small kitchen counter area. I told myself I would figure out how to set it all up and do the ritual later that evening when things cooled down. But right around 5:30 p.m., my factory buddies called me up. They wanted to go hang out, grab some drinks, and explore the city a bit. Being a bored teenager stuck in a hot, empty room, I immediately said yes. I locked the door, went out with my friends, and completely forgot about the bag sitting on the counter. I didn't get back until almost 10 p.m. I was exhausted, so I just drank some water and crashed hard on my mat. That night, the dream came back. It was the exact same setup. The unbearable heat, the open door, and those 5 people standing in the dirt alley. But this time, the atmosphere was heavy and incredibly tense. They weren't just annoyed anymore, they were legitimately angry. I could hear the men pacing back and forth, practically growling about how they should just pin me down, snap my neck, or yank my legs right off the bed to teach me a lesson. The women were complaining that I actually went out and bought the food, but then I just left it sitting on the counter to rot while I went out partying with my friends. They said they had been waiting out there for hours, hungry and ignored. I tried to walk toward the door again to apologize, but the same older woman snapped her head toward me and yelled the exact same warning, telling me not to come closer or I would catch a disease she wouldn't be responsible for. I jolted awake in a cold sweat. I don't remember exactly what time it was, maybe around 3:17 a.m. or something close to that, but the room was pitch black. I scrambled up and looked over at the kitchen counter. The cheap fruits I had bought earlier that afternoon were already completely shriveled and bruised, looking like they had been sitting out in the sun for weeks. It scared the absolute crap out of me. I realized this wasn't just my brain acting up. I was actually dealing with something very real that was getting very impatient. I decided right then and there that I was going to do the offering first thing in the morning. When the sun came up, I grabbed the joss paper and the incense, ready to set it up outside my door. But one of the neighbors walking by gave me this crazy look and told me I was completely out of my mind doing a land offering at 8 in the morning. They said the spirits wouldn't even be around to receive it, and the smoke would just annoy the landlord. They told me I had to wait until the late afternoon, right as the sun was going down. So, I had to wait. I went to my shift, came back around 5 p.m., and finally set everything out. I laid out the fruit, lit 3 sticks of incense, and started burning the joss paper in a small pile on the dirt just outside my door. I was awkwardly whispering apologies, explaining that I was young and stupid and didn't mean any disrespect. Right as the paper was really starting to catch fire and smoke, my aunt pulled up on her motorbike. She had a bunch of boxes strapped to the back of the bike, meaning this was her final trip from the old place. She kicked the kickstand down, took one look at me burning the paper, and completely lost her temper. My aunt was a deeply practical woman who only prayed to Buddha and the earth god. She absolutely despised the idea of feeding wandering ghosts. She always told me that once you feed them, they expect it forever, and the second you forget, they ruin your life. She started yelling at me, demanding to know what the hell I was doing wasting money on this superstition. I tried to explain the dreams, but she wasn't having a single second of it. She told me to pack it up and never do it again while we lived there. I was too intimidated to argue, so I just swept up the ashes and kept my mouth shut. Things actually went totally back to normal for about 3 weeks. My aunt and I got into our daily routine of working long shifts, coming home, eating dinner, and sleeping. The room was cramped, but we made it work. I had almost convinced myself the whole ghost thing was just a weird, isolated incident. Then came the second day of the lunar month. I didn't even track the lunar calendar, but that night, I had another dream. The exact same 5 people were standing outside, muttering about how it was the 2nd of the month, and wondering if the clueless kid was going to feed them or not. I woke up around 4 a.m., totally anxious, and asked my aunt about the date the next morning. She confirmed it was the 2nd of the lunar month, the traditional day businesses make offerings to local spirits. She warned me again not to do anything stupid and left for her longer shift. But I was terrified. After my shift, I went back to the market, found the nice vendor lady, and bought another small offering package. I brought it home, waiting for the late afternoon. My aunt usually worked an hour later than me, so I figured I had a solid window to just set it up and clean it before she ever got back. I laid out the paper and the fruit, but my aunt came home earlier than expected. She walked into the room, saw what I was doing, and absolutely lost her mind. She stormed right over and literally kicked the offering set across the floor with her foot, sending everything scattering. She started swearing like an absolute sailor, throwing out the most vulgar F-bombs you could think of, screaming that she wasn't going to let any dead, freeloading pieces of shit mooch off her hard-earned money in her own home. That night, I had another dream. I was locked inside our dark room, unable to open the door, just helplessly looking out the window. Out in the dirt alley, I saw those same 5 entities swarming my aunt. They weren't just talking anymore. They were aggressively shoving her back and forth like a rag doll, shouting and cursing at her from all sides. I woke up the next morning, and when my aunt got up to brush her teeth, I noticed these dark purple bruises forming right on her biceps and elbows. I frantically tried to tell her about the nightmare, but she just rubbed her arms, muttering about how she had this stupid dream where she got into a massive shouting match with some incredibly rude people who kept shoving her around. But then she just brushed it off, claiming she probably just tossed and turned too hard and left for work. I knew things were escalating, and I was terrified. So, that very same afternoon, I bought the stuff again and tried to secretly apologize for her. I set everything up outside the door, lit the incense, and sat there, waiting exactly 45 minutes for the incense to burn down completely before I could safely scatter the salt and rice. The timing was incredibly screwed up. I was just about to scatter the rice when I heard the familiar rattle of my aunt's motorbike pulling into the alley. She rolled up, still wearing her helmet, and kicked down her kickstand so hard, it made a loud, angry clack. She saw the smoke drifting into our open room and just exploded. She didn't even take her helmet off. She screamed about the smell getting into all our clean clothes hanging inside. And then, she did the one thing you are never, ever supposed to do. She stormed past me, marched right into our tiny bathroom, grabbed a plastic scooper, scooped up water directly from the toilet basin, and marched back out. With one aggressive swing, she splashed the dirty water right onto the burning joss paper and the food offerings. The fire hissed and died instantly, sending up a thick cloud of foul-smelling smoke. She turned on the standing fan, pointing it outward to blow the smoke away, dropping absolute F-bombs and cursing me out the entire time about how I was a gullible idiot. I was practically trembling. I tried to warn her. I told her about the dreams, how those 5 people were getting angry, but she just gave me this look of pure disgust and told me to shut up and clean the mess. That night, the air in that tiny room got so thick and stuffy it felt like I was breathing in hot soup. I eventually fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion, but almost immediately, I was pulled into a nightmare that felt way too real. In this dream, my aunt and I were inside the room. Suddenly, those 5 entities didn't wait outside anymore. They rushed right through the doorway. They ignored me completely and swarmed my aunt. The 3 men grabbed her arms and legs, pinning her down while she thrashed and screamed, swearing at them. The 2 women grabbed her by the hair. We had this bad habit of tying our leftover food and scraps into a small plastic bag and hanging it from a nail in the kitchen area to give to the local pig farmers the next day. In the dream, the entities dragged my aunt toward that specific bag. They shoved her face directly into the rotting food scraps, pushing her head down with brutal force. She was screaming, choking on the garbage, begging for mercy. I tried to run over and pull them off her, but I couldn't move. Sleep paralysis hit me like a ton of bricks. It literally felt like someone had dropped a massive, suffocating concrete block right onto my chest, pinning me to the floor. I couldn't twitch a single muscle, completely frozen in my own body, trapped inside the dream, forced to just watch them torture her. Suddenly, the paralysis broke, and I gasped awake. The room was dark. I don't know what time it was, maybe 2 a.m. I was covered in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. I immediately looked over to my aunt's side of the floor. Her mat was empty. My heart practically jumped straight into my throat, and I swear I almost crapped my pants. I scrambled up, fumbled for the wall switch, and turned on the harsh fluorescent light. I looked toward the kitchen area, and my stomach completely dropped. Holy shit. My aunt was on her knees in the corner of the kitchen. Her head was physically jammed inside the plastic bag of our leftover food garbage. She was violently thrashing her arms around, knocking dirty bowls and metal pots all over the floor, making this horrible, muffled screaming noise. Her eyes were squeezed shut, and she was crying out, begging for them to stop hitting her. I completely lost my mind, screaming at the top of my lungs about what the fucking hell was happening as I sprinted over to her. I grabbed her shoulders and tried to pull her back, but she was incredibly strong, fighting against empty air like she was surrounded by people. I slapped her face. I shook her. I pinched her arms. I even desperately pulled on her sideburns and tried tickling her ribs, but she wouldn't wake up. She was completely trapped in whatever nightmare they had pulled her into, continuing to choke and sob into the garbage bag. I panicked. I didn't know what else to do. I sprinted to the cabinet, grabbed 3 fresh sticks of incense, lit them on the gas stove with shaking hands, and ran out the front door into the pitch-black dirt alley. I fell to my knees in the dirt and just started bowing to the empty air, waving the incense frantically in every direction. I was crying, loudly begging the 5 spirits to forgive her, promising that she didn't know any better and that we would respect them from now on. I prayed out loud for maybe 30 seconds, just pouring out pure desperation. Suddenly, from inside the room, I heard my aunt take a massive, gasping breath. I dropped the incense in the dirt and ran back inside, She had finally pulled her head out of the bag and was sitting on the floor, violently vomiting up the rotting rice and sour soup she had been choking on. She was looking around wildly, completely hysterical, crying my name over and over. When I knelt down to help her up, my stomach completely dropped and I felt like I was gonna throw up. Her arms and shoulders were covered in dark, distinct, hand-shaped bruises. There were red, swollen slap marks across her cheeks. These weren't things she could have done to herself thrashing on the floor. Something had physically beaten her. She spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner, sobbing and shaking, refusing to go to work the next morning. She told me the exact same dream I had just witnessed, describing the 5 people tearing into her for disrespecting their food. She never questioned my warnings again. The very next afternoon, she went out and bought the most elaborate offering setup I had ever seen, silently praying and burning paper with trembling hands. We eventually learned that the entire neighborhood was built over a forgotten graveyard. Turns out, that specific area of Bien Hoa has a history that goes way, way back, literally centuries older than the city of Saigon itself. That meant those 5 spirits had been there for centuries, peacefully guarding their territory, until my aunt pushed them way too far. She's terrified of missing an offering now, but sometimes I just lay awake and think about those 3 sticks of incense I frantically lit outside our door. If I hadn't thought to pray and beg for her life right at that exact second, I honestly don't know if she would have ever woken up from that kitchen floor. I was about 13 at the time, just a city kid from Saigon stuck on this endless, exhausting summer trip. My dad had this bright idea to visit his old stomping grounds in Ben Tri, and then hauled us all the way to Travin to drink with his childhood crew. The adults were busy, so they forced me to hang out with these 4 local guys, and honestly by day 4, we had completely run out of ways to kill time. It is hard to really explain the kind of boredom you experience when you are dragged out to the countryside as a teenager. You are completely disconnected from everything you know. The air down there in the Mekong Delta is just so thick and heavy. It feels like you are breathing in warm soup. I remember the constant sticky sweat on the back of my neck and the deafening noise of the cicadas that just drilled into your skull from morning until night. My dad was having the time of his life, though. He was reconnecting with these 5 guys he used to run around with back in his late teens. They were the kind of guys who used to hop on random cargo trains and rusty buses just to travel around without a dime to their names. Now, they were doing all right. Some were doing great, like owning a hotel, while the poorer ones at least had their own small business going, and they basically spent the whole 5 days drinking heavily and laughing about the good old days. Because they wanted to be left alone to reminisce, I was essentially pawned off on their kids. There were 4 of them, all local guys, ranging from maybe 14 up to 19 years old, including me that made 5 of us, all kin people, just trying to figure out what to do with ourselves. At first, they tried to be good hosts. I recall them taking me to this dark, dingy internet cafe that smelled intensely of cheap instant noodles and stale cigarette smoke. We spent a whole afternoon just climbing trees to hack down fresh coconuts, and they even took me out to paddle those tiny, precarious wooden boats through the muddy canals. It was fun for a minute, but the novelty wears off fast when the heat is just beating down on you, and the mosquitoes are eating you alive. By the time the 3rd or maybe the 4th day rolled around, we were just sitting on the porch of somebody's house, staring at the dirt road, bored out of our freaking minds. I think it was around 4 p.m. when the oldest guy in our group suddenly sat up and suggested we ride out to this local shrine. He said he heard there was going to be a huge festival there that evening. Travin is an incredibly diverse place, and there is a massive population of Khmer people living right alongside the kin folks. They have their own distinct culture, their own language, and an unbelievable amount of holidays and festivals throughout the year. Like out of 365 days a year, they must have close to 100 different holidays. The shrine was located just a few hundred meters away from Ba Om Pond, which is this really famous, massive square pond surrounded by ancient, towering trees with these bizarre roots that stick right out of the ground. I had never really interacted with the Khmer community before, so the older guys told me it would be a good chance to see something new instead of just rotting on the porch. We had nothing better to do, so we hopped on these rusty, squeaking bicycles and started pedaling down the dusty roads as the afternoon heat finally started to break. When we pulled up to the grounds, I was honestly amazed. It was not a typical temple, but more like a massive communal shrine, and the place was absolutely packed. I am talking hundreds of people milling around. The visual overload was intense. There were so many people dressed in these stunning, vibrant traditional outfits, with gold accents catching the late afternoon sun. There was music playing, the heavy scent of burning incense thick in the air, and just a general feeling of celebration. It felt incredibly lively. I remember noticing this one specific man who seemed to be the center of attention. He was an older Khmer gentleman, probably in his late 70s or early 80s, and you could just tell he was the absolute boss of that place. He was not dressed in anything overly flashy, but every single person who walked past him would stop, cross their arms over their chest, and bow their heads in deep respect. He was holding a microphone and addressing the crowd, speaking entirely in Khmer. I could not understand a single word he was saying, but he just had that deep, booming voice that made you want to shut up and listen. Every time he paused, the entire crowd would erupt into applause and cheers. My local friends whispered to me that he was a highly respected elder in the community, a guy who had been leading these ceremonies for decades. We hung out there for a couple of hours, just soaking in the atmosphere, watching the processions, and grabbing random snacks. But as the sun went down, the vibe started to shift. The sky bruised into this deep, purple color, and the shadows from the ancient trees stretched out long and distorted across the courtyard. It must have been getting close to 6 p.m., or maybe 7 p.m. The festival was still going strong, but my friends and I were getting tired. We decided it was probably time to head back before it got completely dark. We were walking toward the edge of the property to grab our bicycles. I remember the exact sound of my friend kicking the metal kickstand up, and then, completely out of nowhere, the festive music and the happy chatter were completely shattered by people screaming their damn lungs out. It was not a playful scream. It was the kind of raw, guttural noise that instantly makes the hair on your arms stand up. The crowd near the center of the courtyard suddenly convulsed and ripped apart as people scrambled backward to get away from something. I heard frantic yelling in both Khmer and Vietnamese. People were shouting about a fight, yelling for someone to grab the kid, screaming that somebody was going to die. Naturally, being stupid teenagers, we did not run away. We actually dropped our bikes and pushed our way through the panicked crowd to see what was happening. The circle of people had cleared out, leaving a wide space on the tiled floor. When I finally got a clear view of the center, my brain just stopped working. I expected to see two drunk guys throwing punches, but what I saw was so screwed up that my stomach immediately tied itself into knots. It was a kid, a young Khmer boy, maybe 12 or 13 years old, exactly my age. He had launched himself at the highly respected elder from behind. He was not just attacking the old man. He had climbed onto the elder's back and wrapped his legs around the man's torso in this iron-tight wrestling grip, pinning the old guy's arms so he couldn't even fight back. But the kid was not throwing punches. He was fucking biting. I will never get the image out of my head. The silence of the shock around us was absolutely suffocating until I heard this wet, tearing sound of teeth sinking into flesh and tearing it away. The kid was thrashing his head back and forth like a rabid dog, sinking his teeth into the old man's hair, his neck, his hands and arms, anywhere he could reach. It was a bloodbath. It was not like the movies where blood politely drips down a chin. It was spraying. Thick, dark blood was flying through the air and splattering violently against the pale tiles. The old man was screaming in absolute agony, trying to shake the kid off, but the boy was clamped onto him with a strength that a 13-year-old human body should not possess. They fell hard to the ground, rolling and sliding in this expanding pool of dark red slush. The boy's face was completely smeared in gore, his eyes wide and completely blank, just chewing and tearing at the elder's skin. People finally snapped out of their shock and rushed in to help. Big, grown men were grabbing the kid by the shoulders, trying to pry him off, but it was like trying to pry a steel trap open with your bare hands. The kid did not even blink. He just kept digging his teeth deeper into the elder's neck. It escalated to absolute panic. People grabbed thick wooden walking sticks and started beating the kid right there on the ground. They were swinging with genuine force, bringing the wood down hard across the boy's back and ribs, trying to inflict enough pain to make him let go. But the boy did not make a single sound. He did not flinch, he did not cry out. He just kept swallowing blood and biting down harder. It was pure, terrifying bullshit to watch. I remember the older kin guys standing near us started whispering frantically, their voices trembling as they said the boy must be possessed by the tiger spirit because he was literally hunting the old man like a wild animal. The Khmer folks had a completely different reaction. They did not believe in the tiger spirit, but they knew something deeply evil had taken hold of the child. Some people ran to grab buckets of water and aggressively splashed it over the two of them, while others started frantically throwing handfuls of salt and raw rice at the boy, loudly chanting protective charms and prayers. It was pure, unfiltered chaos, and the most terrifying part was how long it lasted. This was not a quick scuffle. This nightmare dragged on for maybe 15 or 20 excruciating minutes. Finally, for absolutely no physical reason, the boy just stopped. His jaw unlocked, his eyes rolled back into his head, and his body went entirely limp. He completely collapsed onto the bloody tiles. The elder was already unconscious, his clothes soaked a horrific, heavy crimson. People immediately rushed in, scooped the bleeding old man up, and practically threw him onto the middle of a motorbike, sandwiching him between a driver and another guy on the back to rush him to the nearest medical clinic. They were terrified he was going to bleed out right there in the courtyard. The crowd stepped back from the boy, leaving him lying alone in the middle of this massive puddle of blood. I noticed he did not have a single scratch on him from the beating. The sticks had done absolutely nothing. We all just stood there staring at him, waiting to see what would happen. Maybe 2 or 3 minutes passed. Then, the boy's fingers twitched. He slowly pushed himself up onto his hands and knees. The moment he opened his eyes, you could tell whatever had been inside him was gone. He looked completely bewildered. He blinked against the harsh lights, and then his body violently rejected what was in his mouth. He started gagging, his small frame heaving as he vomited up thick clumps of the elder's blood right onto the floor. He wiped his mouth, looked at his hands, looked at the horrifying mess around him, and completely broke down. He started sobbing hysterically, shaking his head side to side, holding his hands up defensively as the angry crowd started shouting at him. They were pointing at the blood, screaming at him in Khmer, asking why the hell he would do something so monstrous to the elder. The kid just kept crying, his voice cracking as he desperately swore over and over again in his native language that he did not do it, that he had no idea what was happening. His parents eventually pushed through the crowd, crying and screaming in a mix of terror and shame. They ran up to him and slapped him hard across the face, shaking him, demanding to know what got into him. But the kid just looked at them with pure, empty terror. He had zero memory of the last 30 minutes. The festival was completely ruined. People started dispersing in hushed, frightened groups. The local police eventually showed up, but the situation was complicated. The attacker was literally a child. They could not exactly slap handcuffs on a 13-year-old boy who was currently having a mental breakdown. Instead of making an arrest, they guided the boy, his parents, and a few witnesses into a small room inside the temple to take statements. My friends and I were way too rattled to ride our bikes home in the dark, so we just lingered near the back of the temple with a group of older kin residents who were extremely nosy and wanted to know what the police were saying. Living in Travin, a lot of the kin locals spoke fluent Khmer due to decades of trading and intermarrying, so they were eavesdropping on the interrogation through the open windows and translating the details for the rest of us in tight, nervous whispers. The interrogation dragged on for over an hour. The kid was hyperventilating the whole time, but he managed to explain exactly what happened right before he lost control. He told the police that while he was walking around the edges of the festival earlier that evening, he kept seeing a strange man standing in the deep shadows behind the main temple building. The kid said the man was hovering right next to an unmarked, sunken dirt grave that looked incredibly old. Nobody ever went back there, but this man just stood completely still, staring right at the boy. The kid said the man suddenly snorted, a sharp, wet sniffle, and then called out to him in a raspy Khmer dialect. He told the police exactly what the shadow had said. "Come here. Let me borrow your body." The boy said the words made his skin crawl. He was completely terrified, so he turned around and tried to walk back into the crowded courtyard. But he told the cops that his legs suddenly felt incredibly heavy. He got incredibly disoriented, wandering around in circles, his vision swimming. The next thing he knew, his body moved entirely on its own, and he found himself standing at the very back of the property, right next to the dirt grave. The man was standing shoulder to shoulder with him. The boy said the man turned, lunged straight into the boy's chest, and everything instantly went black. He did not remember the attack. He did not remember the biting. The next memory he had was waking up on the floor, choking on a mouthful of warm blood. The police basically wrapped up the interview after that. There was nothing more to extract from a hysterical child claiming a ghost made him do it. But as the crowd finally started to thin out, and we prepared to leave, the older kinmen gathered us closer. They kept casting nervous glances around to make sure none of the Khmer locals were within earshot, because what they were about to tell us was considered highly offensive and incredibly dangerous to talk about openly. One of the men, a guy who looked to be in his late 60s, lit a cigarette with shaking hands. He told us that to understand what just happened, we had to go back to right after the war ended in 75, specifically around 76 or 77. People were absolutely losing their shit over the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot's regime. The older man explained that back then, the Khmer Rouge would send undercover operatives into Vietnamese territory, specifically infiltrating the local Khmer communities in places like Tra Vinh and An Giang to gather intel for future invasions. Because of this, the Kin population was heavily suspicious of everyone. You could not just look at a person and know if they were an innocent Cambodian refugee, a local Vietnamese Khmer, or a bloodthirsty Pol Pot spy. It created a toxic, deadly environment where people started accusing their neighbors just to deflect suspicion from themselves. The rule of law was shattered. If someone accused you of being a spy, you were basically guilty until you could miraculously prove yourself innocent. The older man took a drag of his cigarette and pointed a subtle finger toward the front of the temple where the blood was still being mopped up. He told us that back in those days, that highly respected elder we saw tonight was nobody. He was just a regular low-level neighborhood watch guy with no real power or influence. But then, the elder made a massive discovery. He publicly accused a young 17-year-old boy of being a sleeper agent for Pol Pot. The men told us that the accused teenager was a total drifter. He was an orphan who had fled the violence in Cambodia and wandered down to Tra Vinh just looking for food and a safe place to sleep among his own people. The kid was completely illiterate. Back then, out of 10 people, maybe only 2 or 3 actually had proper ID papers, and this kid had absolutely nothing. He had no family to vouch for him and lacked the vocabulary to defend himself against the accusations. He was terrified and helpless. Because he could not prove his innocence, the community dragged him out to the back of this exact temple. They tied a rope around his neck, strung him up from one of the ancient trees, and publicly hanged him until he choked to death. The older man told us they cut the teenager down and buried him right there in the dirt behind the shrine. It was a calculated spiritual punishment. They buried him on temple grounds so the local deities would permanently pin his soul down, preventing his angry ghost from wandering the earth and seeking revenge on the people who killed him. And from that day forward, the elder's life completely changed. By claiming he had successfully rooted out a dangerous spy, he gained massive credibility. The community started looking up to him. Over the next 40 years, he parlayed that one execution into a lifetime of respect, eventually becoming the untouchable, holy figure we saw speaking on the microphone tonight. When the old man finished the story, the silence among us was heavier than the humid night air. None of us wanted to say a word. We just quietly picked up our bicycles and rode back in the dark, constantly looking over our shoulders. To this day, the whole thing is just a giant, messed up question mark. You've got half the town thinking the ghost was a real spy getting his revenge, and the other half swearing it was an innocent kid who was framed by the elder for clout. But honestly, innocent or not, that level of hatred just doesn't fade away. I still kick myself when I think about how a simple job transfer 7 or 8 years ago ended up ruining my life. I mean, I was doing IT support, living in District 10, when my bosses shipped me over to a new branch near Unmarked in District 8 to train their new department. Instead of my normal office hours, I was suddenly stuck dealing with slow-learning rookies until 8 or 9 at night, you know? Of course, this all went down during a week of torrential, non-stop Saigon rain, forcing me to commute home through weather so bad you couldn't even see your own hand in front of your face. Look, I am just a typical tech guy. Like, I wear thick glasses, I stare at code all day, and I generally prefer computers over dealing with actual human beings. Before this whole mess started, my life was blissfully boring. I would clock in at District 6 at 7:30 in the morning, do my standard corporate routine, and head home by 5. It was easy. It was predictable. But this new assignment completely threw my routine into a blender. My company wanted me to train this whole fresh batch of college grads on our internal software. It wasn't just a quick orientation. I had to babysit 5 to 7 people at a time. If they were quick learners, I could actually wrap up by 2 or 3 in the afternoon and go home early to relax. And honestly, the pay bump they gave me for this training gig was pretty sweet. But you know how it is with fresh grads. Some days they just could not grasp the simplest concepts. IT work requires extreme focus, and one wrong line of code can crash an entire system, so I had to sit there and do one-on-one sessions with them. That meant there were days I was trapped in that office until almost 9 at night, just grinding my teeth and trying to explain the same thing for the 100th time. The first week was fine. I got off early a few times. But right as we hit the second week, my luck completely ran out. The group I was assigned to train was just impossibly slow, and to make it infinitely worse, we hit the peak of the Saigon rainy season. Now, if you have never experienced a monsoon in this city, you need to understand that it is not just a little drizzle. The sky basically tears open and dumps an ocean on the streets for days on end without a single break. So it was around 9 at night on a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. I honestly cannot remember because the exhaustion was just melting my brain. I was heading home from the Zom Kui market area, which meant I had to cross over the Chava Bridge to get back toward Hai Thuong Lan Ong Street, the roundabout at Chao Van Lim, right through Cho Lon, and finally District 10. The rain was absolutely relentless. It was that kind of heavy, whiteout rain where the streets completely empty out, because nobody in their right mind wants to be outside. But I had no choice. I was on my scooter, wrapped up in this massive, heavy batwing raincoat that kept catching the wind and making me feel like a giant, soaked trash bag flapping in a hurricane. Because I wear glasses, riding in a storm is a special kind of hell. The water instantly fogs up the lenses, the streetlights reflect off every single raindrop, and you end up having to squint so hard your head starts pounding. I was crawling along the side of the bridge at maybe 20 kilometers an hour, totally tense, just praying I wouldn't slide on the slippery asphalt. The bridge was completely deserted, just me and the deafening sound of the wind and the rain hitting my helmet. Out of nowhere, this sleek car comes speeding up from behind me, laying on its horn like a complete jerk before blasting right past me. Its tires hit a massive puddle, sending a giant wave of muddy water directly into my face and chest. My handlebars jerked violently, and I completely lost my balance, having to slam my feet down to stop myself from wiping out on the concrete. I was so incredibly mad. I remember gripping my brakes and just shouting into the storm about how this rich idiot could buy a fancy car but could not afford basic human decency while the rest of us were out here risking our necks in the flood. I pulled my scooter right up close to the curb to catch my breath and took my glasses off to wipe away the gritty water. I was annoyed, shivering, and just totally done with the day. I rubbed my eyes, slipped my wet glasses back onto my face, and looked up. That was when I saw her. Standing right there on the raised pedestrian curb, maybe an arm's length higher than the road, was a little girl. She looked about 7 or 8 years old, with pale skin and her hair braided up into 2 neat pigtails. The thing that instantly short-circuited my brain was her outfit. She was wearing this light blue, ruffled party dress. It was the kind of fancy dress you would put a kid in for a family wedding, not for standing on a bridge in the middle of a literal typhoon. The wind was whipping around her, but she did not seem bothered at all. She was not crying, she was not looking for help. She was just looking down at her feet, holding the edges of her dress, and doing this weird little twirling dance in the freezing rain. My anger completely vanished, replaced by this deep, heavy confusion. I slowly rolled my scooter a few feet forward until I was just a short distance away from her, my headlight illuminating the raindrops bouncing off the concrete around her. I called out over the storm, asking her where she lived and if she was lost. I even offered to give her a ride home, because my exhausted brain just assumed she must live in one of the nearby alleys and wandered out by mistake. She did not say a word. She just slowly stopped dancing, lifted her head, and gave me this wide, unsettling smile. Then she let out a really loud, surprised gasp, literally going, "Huh," raising her eyebrows as if she was genuinely shocked that I could actually see her. Before I could even process how weird that was, a voice practically exploded from the darkness behind her. It was a woman's voice, incredibly harsh and dripping with venom. "Tegan, get over here and look at me." I flinched and peered through the rain, seeing an older woman standing about 10 meters down the walkway. She was the textbook definition of a rough street sleeper. Her clothes were shredded and filthy, her hair was a matted nest, and she just had this aura of pure misery around her. It is pretty common to see homeless folks camping out on these big bridges like Chava or Nguyen Van Q, so my rational brain immediately kicked in. I watched the little girl's face completely drop from that weird smile into a look of absolute defeat, and she slowly trudged over to the ragged woman. I figured it was just a tragic situation. A homeless mother and her kid, probably wearing some nice dress they got from a charity donation, just trying to survive the storm. I felt a pang of pity, but I was freezing and exhausted, so I just revved my engine and pushed through the rain to get back to my warm apartment. But I could not shake the image of them from my head. I kept trying to rationalize why a mother would let her kid dance on a slippery curb in a storm, but eventually I just chalked it up to the harsh realities of street life. The truly screwed up part started the next night. I was stuck late at work again. It was pouring again. I crossed the Chava Bridge at almost the exact same time, and they were there. Again. The girl in the blue dress, doing her little dance, and the filthy woman standing nearby in the shadows like a warden. I saw them for 3 consecutive nights. Every single time, the weather was miserable, the streets were flooded, and the girl was wearing that exact same thin blue dress, completely unfazed by the cold. By the 3rd night, a deep, primal unease started creeping up my spine. It felt too staged, too repetitive. I convinced myself they were running some kind of panhandling scam, trying to bait sympathetic drivers, so I forced myself to just look straight ahead and drive past them without stopping. Then came the final day. It was late afternoon, and I had managed to finish my training session early. The rain that day was somehow even worse than the nights before. It was a torrential, blinding sheet of water. Traffic was backed up, and everyone was barely moving. I was trailing right behind these 2 large SUVs that were crawling side by side at maybe 15 kilometers an hour, staying tight to the curb to avoid the deeper water. My mind was completely blank. I was not thinking about the girl or the homeless woman. I was entirely focused on getting home before the water damaged the expensive work laptops I had stashed by my feet under my raincoat. The SUVs in front of me finally cleared a bottleneck and hit the gas, speeding forward into an open stretch of road. Muscle memory took over, and I twisted my throttle to follow right behind them. The second my scooter surged forward, the little girl in the blue dress just popped up right out of nowhere and leaped straight off the curb, landing directly in front of my front tire. I grabbed both brakes so hard my tires locked, and my scooter violently skidded sideways on the wet road, stopping mere inches away from her legs. My heart practically exploded in my chest. I was hyperventilating, wiping the rain from my eyes, trying to make sense of what the fuck just happened. She did not flinch. She was just standing there in front of my headlight, swaying slightly, holding the edges of her blue dress. The panic instantly morphed into this furious, adrenaline-fueled anger. I laid on my horn, yelling at her through the storm to get out of the street before she got killed, demanding to know where her mother was and telling her to get back on the sidewalk immediately. She slowly looked up at me, and her expression made my stomach drop into a bottomless pit. She was pouting, but her eyes were filled with this desperate, agonizing plea for help. It was the exact look you see on those poor kids forced to sell lottery tickets late at night, just completely broken, and begging you to save them. My dumb, rational brain still thought she wanted money. I yelled out that I would help her tomorrow, explaining that my wallet was buried deep in my scooter trunk, and I could not open it in this downpour. She refused to move. She just stood there, staring a hole through me. I was so incredibly frustrated and cold that I kicked my kickstand down, fully intending to grab her by the arm and physically carry her to the safety of the sidewalk. The second my boot touched the wet asphalt, that voice sliced through the heavy rain again. "Tegan, where are you going? Who are you looking for? You are staying right here. You hear me? You stay here with me." The homeless woman was standing on the curb, glaring at me with a hatred so intense it felt physical. The little girl hung her head, her shoulders slumping in this heartbreaking way, and she slowly shuffled past my scooter toward the old woman. I was shivering, partly from the freezing rain, and partly from something else I could not quite explain. I got back on my seat, flipped up my kickstand, and hit the ignition. As the engine sputtered to life, I glanced back over my shoulder just to make sure they were out of the street. They were gone. It had been maybe 3 seconds. There was nowhere for them to hide on that open bridge. They did not jump into the river, and they did not run down the street. They simply ceased to exist. But the silence was completely suffocating until I noticed something sitting right on the raised concrete curb, exactly where the homeless woman had been standing, and my entire body locked up in absolute terror, because sitting there in the pouring rain was a tiny, incredibly old ceramic incense burner. There was no photograph, no flowers, and no tiny water cups, just a solitary pot filled with wet sand sitting right where their feet had touched the ground a fraction of a second ago. My stomach dropped straight to my knees. I felt goosebumps erupt up and down my arms, and a wave of pure, unfiltered panic hijacked my nervous system. I did not even look back again. I cranked the throttle and rode out of there like a bat out of hell, completely losing my freaking mind because I finally realized I had been interacting with ghosts for an entire week. When I burst through my front door, pale and shaking, my mom immediately knew something was horribly wrong. I dumped the whole story on her. Now, my mom is a deeply superstitious woman who believes in every omen and spirit under the sun. She immediately decided that this was a crisis that required professional intervention. The very next morning, she dragged me across town to see some local psychic in Funiyao she completely trusted. We sat down in this cramped, incense-choked room, and I told the psychic everything. The old lady closed her eyes, did some weird finger-counting calculation, and confidently declared that the little girl was actually my unborn child. She looked me dead in the eye and claimed I must have gotten an ex-girlfriend pregnant in the past, and she had secretly gotten an abortion, which is why the spirit was following me. I was absolutely floored and immediately argued back, telling her she was out of her mind and that I had never been in that situation. But the psychic just doubled down, aggressively stating that her readings were never wrong and that the older homeless woman I saw was actually the spirit of my ex-girlfriend's mother watching over the child. I thought it was complete bullshit, but my mom was totally terrified by the psychic's authority. She forced me, a grown man, to pull out my phone and awkwardly text my ex-girlfriends from years ago to ask if they had ever hidden a pregnancy from me. I actually sent those texts, and I got chewed out so badly. One of my exes called me a certified psychopath for bringing up imaginary abortions 3 years after we broke up. I showed the angry replies to my mom, hoping she would drop it, but she was fully committed to the psychic's narrative. She convinced herself the girls were just lying to protect their secrets. That afternoon, without telling me, my mom actually went out, bought a bunch of spiritual offerings, and went near the bridge to perform a ritual, officially inviting the spirit of the little girl into our home because she believed it was her tragic, lost granddaughter. It was the single worst mistake she could have ever made. A few days later, the dreams started. In my sleep, I was sitting in my own living room, and that little girl in the blue dress was there. She was calling me Dad. She was pouring me water, scooping rice into my bowl, turning on the TV for me, just acting like a normal, loving daughter. At first, I woke up feeling deeply disturbed, brushing it off as my subconscious dealing with the trauma. But the third dream was different. It was a lucid dream. I was fully aware that I was dreaming, and I could feel the coldness of her small hand when she tried to grab mine. I violently yanked my arm away, yelling at her that I was not her father, that I was not married, and demanding to know why she followed me from the bridge. "You're just some beggar kid from the street," I told her, "so don't try to latch onto me like we're family." She looked up at me, her face completely pale, and started crying. She told me that her grandmother had brought her to this house and promised her that I was her dad. I felt a chill in my dream and demanded to know her real mother's name. She sniffled and said, "Abigail." I jolted awake in a cold sweat. I looked at the clock. It was exactly 3:11 a.m. I do not know anyone named Abigail. I have never dated anyone named Abigail. I knew with absolute certainty that this entity in my house had zero biological connection to me. The next morning, I told my mom about the name. All the color washed out of her face. "Oh shit," she stammered. "Did I just invite a wandering street ghost into our home?" She realized she had essentially performed a ritual to invite a random, wandering street spirit directly into our living space. We immediately drove back to the Zomkui market area near the bridge, desperate for real answers. We ended up talking to the local street vendors and motorbike taxi drivers who hang around there all day. Those people are basically the neighborhood's human security cameras. They know every single thing that happens on that street. And sure enough, an older woman selling iced tea cracked the whole mystery wide open. When we described the girl in the blue dress, the vendor corrected us. She explained that a horrific accident had happened right on that bridge back around 2013 or 2014. A mother had been driving her little girl, named Tegan, home from a fancy wedding during a terrible rainstorm. The girl was wearing a long, ruffled party dress with a sash. As they rode over the bridge, the sash slipped and got deeply tangled in the spokes of the motorbike's rear wheel. The violent yank pulled the little girl backward off the bike and straight onto the asphalt, and a speeding car, coming up right behind them, ran straight over her body. She died instantly. Her devastated mother had placed that small incense burner on the curb to mourn her, but the vendor dropped a detail that made my blood run ice cold. The mother of the little girl was still alive. She still lived in the neighborhood. The vendor then told us about the homeless woman. About a month or two before little Tegan's tragic accident, a violent, drug-addicted homeless woman had died from a severe overdose on that exact same spot on the bridge. It all clicked into place, creating a picture so horrifying it made me nauseous. The angry, aggressive spirit of the junkie had claimed that territory. When Tegan died there shortly after, that malicious entity basically hijacked the little girl's soul, keeping her trapped as a spiritual hostage. That is why the girl's family could never successfully summon her spirit home during their mourning rituals. The old ghost refused to let her leave, constantly dominating her, screaming at her to stay. Tegan had sensed that my energy was vulnerable, or maybe she was just so desperate that she risked the old woman's wrath to throw herself in front of my bike, begging me to help her escape. We managed to get the address of Tegan's real mother, Abigail, who lived less than a kilometer away from the bridge. We knocked on her door and gently relayed everything I had experienced. We also saw that she had another kid now, a little 5 or 6-year-old running around. The poor woman broke down sobbing hysterically in her living room. We were just the messengers, delivering the closure she desperately needed. She swore she was going to hire the most powerful spiritual master she could find to go to that bridge, banish the junkie's spirit, and finally bring her daughter's soul home to rest. I never took that bridge again, but I just lie awake crying, picturing that little girl stuck in that endless nightmare. For 3 years, she was less than a kilometer from her warm bed, held captive by that wretched homeless woman, watching her mom drive past her without ever being able to reach out. It's a kind of hell I wouldn't wish on anyone. So do yourself a favor. If you're ever wearing a long dress or a scarf on a bike, make sure it's secured, because 1 second of carelessness can steal your soul away just like that. So this happened way back, probably around 2000 or 2002. My family lived in District 6, right near the Fulham area. I was maybe 6 years old, born around 94 or 95, but I went to more weddings than most adults. You know how it is, your parents toss some cash in the wedding envelope, so they bring the kid along to maximize the buffet returns. It's kinda screwed up, but that was the culture. Anyway, we were heading to this insanely fancy restaurant on the 2nd floor of an apartment complex in Cholan. I have to keep the real name of the building hidden for obvious reasons, so let's just call it the ABC complex. It was like the absolute peak of luxury at the time. Look, I need to paint a picture of what these events were actually like back then, so you understand why I was even in this situation. Going to a wedding wasn't just a casual dinner. It was a whole strategic operation for my parents. I remember my mom opening the fancy invitation and gasping. She turned to my dad and said, "Man, her dad is insanely rich from his export business, and this is his only daughter getting married. No wonder they booked the ABC complex." My dad just rubbed his face and mumbled, "Well, crap. Guess we have to put at least 300,000 dong in the envelope then? That's like 15 bucks? Because they were dropping that kind of money, they would literally starve me to make sure we ate our money's worth. I am not kidding. My mom fed me a small bowl of rice at noon, and then strictly forbade me from eating anything else for the rest of the afternoon. It sounds totally ridiculous now, but that was just how things operated in our neighborhood. You show up, you eat until it hurts, and you take home the leftovers. The other unwritten rule of Vietnamese weddings is that if the invitation says the party starts at 5 p.m., you absolutely do not show up before 6 o'clock, unless you want to stand around in a hot lobby, making awkward small talk. So by the time we actually pulled up to this massive, glittering building, it was probably past 6:15 p.m. or something, and I had been starving for over 6 hours. My stomach was doing flips. I was this cranky little kid stuffed into an uncomfortable button-down shirt that was way too stiff, just desperate for some food. The ABC building itself was this colossal structure. To host a wedding there meant you had serious connections, or just an absurd amount of money. The whole ground floor was absolute chaos. There were dozens of taxis pulling up, hundreds of people dressed to the nines, the overwhelming smell of heavy perfume mixing with the exhaust fumes from the street, and this loud, chaotic chatter bouncing off the marble walls. My parents immediately got sucked into the mandatory greeting line. They had to shake hands with the bride, the groom, the parents of the bride, the parents of the groom, sign the guest book, drop the envelope in the box, and take a million formal photos. I was standing right next to my mom, literally tugging on her dress and whining about being hungry. I just kept begging her to let us go upstairs and eat. After about 5 minutes of me being an absolute nuisance, my mom just got fed up. She leaned down and told me to just go upstairs by myself to find our table while they finished talking to all the relatives. She pointed out the big, glowing sign that listed the bride and groom's names and told me the reception was up on the 2nd floor. Honestly, back then, letting a 6-year-old wander around a high-end commercial building was pretty normal. Nobody worried about kids getting snatched in a place like that, and I was a pretty independent kid who could already read basic words anyway. So I left the noisy, crowded lobby and headed for the escalators. And let me tell you, just having an automatic escalator inside a building back in 2001 or 2002, was considered a massive luxury. The layout of this place was a bit weird. To get to the restaurant on the second floor, you had to take a zigzagging series of escalators through the first floor mezzanine. But because it was the evening, all the little clothing kiosks and jewelry shops on the first floor were completely shut down, with their metal grates pulled tight. It was just this super weird vibe. Downstairs was a deafening party, but the second I stepped onto that first escalator, the noise just vanished. It was suddenly just me, the harsh fluorescent lights, and the low mechanical humming of the escalator steps moving upward. I remember feeling this weird sense of isolation, but I was so hyper-focused on getting my hands on some shrimp crackers that I just kept walking up the moving stairs to speed things up. I was about halfway up the first escalator, looking up toward the next one that led from the first floor to the second. That was when I saw them, just hovering right at the top edge of the next escalator, looking straight down at me, were 5 heads. It was such an odd sight that my brain actually struggled to process it for a second. 2 of them had bare heads with messy hair, and the other 3 were wearing those bright yellow hard hats that construction workers always wear on big job sites. Even from that distance, I could see their faces were totally smeared with dirt, wet cement, and streaks of cheap gray paint. I just stood there on my escalator, slowly being carried upward, staring at them. The thing that really messed with my head was that they were on an escalator that was actively moving upward, but they weren't going anywhere. They were just maintaining their position. I tried to rationalize it. I figured either the escalator was broken and they were just standing on the stationary metal steps, or they were actively walking backward against the upward motion just to stay in that exact spot to watch me. Both options were weird, but I was just a kid. I stared at them for a solid 15 seconds as my escalator carried me to the first floor landing. I kept wondering why construction workers in filthy, torn clothes were hanging around a luxury wedding venue where everyone else was wearing tailored suits and fancy dresses. It just didn't compute. But by the time I stepped off my escalator and walked around the corner to get on the next one, the space was completely empty. The 5 men were gone, and the escalator was running perfectly fine. I figured they just walked away. I stepped onto the second escalator, resting my hand on the rubber rail. I had only been moving upward for maybe 3 seconds when the quietness of that empty floor just vanished in a second. It was this awful, grinding industrial noise. It sounded exactly like a heavy-duty drill biting into solid concrete, mixed with the heavy metallic clanking and the sharp, wet scraping of tools against stone all at once. It was incredibly loud in that empty space. I turned around on the moving steps and looked back down at the first floor I had just left. The 5 men were down there now. They were gathered around one of those massive structural pillars that hold up the apartment complex. These pillars were huge, maybe almost 2 meters wide, and all 5 of them were actively working on this single column. One guy was leaning his entire body weight into a heavy power drill. Another guy was vigorously rolling paint onto the concrete. The third was aggressively scraping a trowel full of wet mortar against the edge, while another was haphazardly stacking loose bricks. Even at 6 years old, I knew something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. You do not drill, build a brick wall, plaster it, and paint it all at the exact same time on the exact same square foot of space. It makes absolutely no logical sense. They were all just huddled together, frantically scraping and drilling into this pillar, making this god-awful noise. But my innocent little kid brain just felt bad for them. I literally thought about how sad it was that these guys were doing hard manual labor late in the evening, while I was about to go eat a massive feast. I just watched them work until the escalator carried me up to the second floor and they disappeared from my view. I walked into the grand reception hall, and it was everything you would expect. Huge crystal chandeliers, thick red carpets, loud generic pop music blasting from the stage speakers, and dozens of massive round tables covered in white linens. I found some other kids I vaguely knew from the neighborhood, including this one chubby, pale, rich kid named Tatum, and a bunch of other kids from both the bride and groom's sides. We just ran around playing tag for a bit until the rest of the guests finally came up, and the ceremony officially started. We all sat down at our designated table. Because we weren't super close family, our table was shoved all the way in the back, right next to the main double doors leading out to the reception lobby. The MC got on stage, the lights dimmed, the romantic music swelled, and everyone in the room turned their chairs to watch the bride and groom cut the cake. I was bored out of my mind, just tapping my chopsticks on the table, waiting for the first course to arrive. That was when I heard it again, cutting right through the loud romantic music and the cheering crowd, filtering through the open double doors right next to me, was that exact same metallic, grinding drill sound. It was an unmistakable high-pitched drilling and scraping noise. I turned in my chair and looked out the doors into the reception area. The lobby was completely empty now since everyone was inside the hall. Except for the wall directly across from the doors, the 5 men were standing there. They were lined up perfectly horizontally against the nice wallpaper. 2 bare heads, 3 yellow hard hats. They still had their tools, the drill, the paint roller, the trowel, and they were actively destroying the wall. They were drilling and scraping right into the expensive decor. But the detail that made my stomach tie itself into a knot was their posture. Their bodies were pressed facing the wall. Their hands were violently working the tools, but all 5 of their heads were twisted completely sideways, looking past their own shoulders, straight into the banquet hall. They were watching the wedding ceremony on the stage. Their bodies were doing one thing, but their attention was completely fixed on the bright lights and the happy couple. I just sat there, staring at them through the doorway. It was so bizarre. I wondered how they got up to the 2nd floor without me noticing, and why nobody else seemed to hear the deafening sound of a drill destroying the lobby. At one point, 2 of the men shifted their gaze from the stage and made direct eye contact with me. I expected them to look angry or tell me to look away, but they didn't. They actually raised their eyebrows at me in this playful, exaggerated way that adults do when they are teasing a kid. It was so disarming that I actually smiled back at them. I turned back to the table. The first courses were finally arriving. Beautiful plates of roasted pork with crispy skin, massive steaming buns, coconut core salad, and rich soups. Everyone was digging in. I looked at the incredible food, and then I thought about those 5 guys in their torn, dirty clothes standing out in the hallway. I tugged on my mom's sleeve and asked her to put a few extra pieces of pork on my plate. She immediately snapped at me, whispering harshly that I needed to eat what I was given, and not be greedy because you can't just ask for endless refills at a luxury banquet. I tried to explain myself. I told her I wanted to save some food to give to the poor construction workers outside in the lobby because they looked really hungry. My mom just stopped chewing and glared at me. She smacked me on the back of the head, hard enough to sting, and scolded me for talking nonsense. She told me to stop making up stupid stories because there were absolutely no beggars or workers allowed on the premium floor of a 5-star restaurant. I rubbed my head and looked back out the doors. She was right. The lobby was completely empty. The men were gone. I just quietly ate my soup, figuring they had moved on to another part of the building. The dinner progressed, and as it always happens at these big chaotic tables, things started getting messy. I think I dropped my toy car, or maybe it was a shoe. I can't even remember now, but it rolled under the table. Now, I have to mention a really gross habit that some older folks had back then. A lot of people lacked basic table manners at these banquets. Instead of putting chicken bones or fish spines on a designated discard plate, they would literally just throw their chewed-up bones and half-eaten scraps straight onto the floor under the table for the staff to sweep up later. It was disgusting, but it happened everywhere. So I crawled down under the table to find my toy. The tablecloths at this place didn't drape all the way to the floor. They stopped about a foot above the carpet, which meant that when I was down there in the dark, I had a clear line of sight under all the neighboring tables in our section. It was dark and smelled like spilled beer and dirty shoes. I was feeling around the carpet for my toy when I glanced over at the space beneath the table right next to ours. There were 10 adults sitting there, 20 nice leather shoes and high heels resting on the carpet, and weaving between those legs, crouching in the darkness, were the construction workers. Under one table, a guy in a yellow hard hat was squatting on his heels. Under another table, 2 men were sitting cross-legged, One guy was literally lying flat on his stomach against the carpet. They were frantically grabbing the greasy chicken bones, the sucked clean fish spines, and the discarded soggy pieces of leftover buns that the wealthy guests were dropping onto the floor. They were shoving the garbage into their mouths, chewing with this desperate, animalistic intensity. They looked like they were starving to death, eating the literal trash from beneath people's feet with absolute joy. I just froze on my hands and knees, my eyes wide in the gloom. I didn't feel scared in that moment. I just felt this crushing wave of profound sadness. I couldn't comprehend how the world could be so cruel. How could these grown men be forced to crawl on their bellies in the dark to eat our garbage, while we sat on comfortable chairs eating fresh roasted meat? I grabbed my toys and scrambled back up into my chair. I looked at the large serving plate in the center of our table. There were 2 plain steamed buns left, and a couple of thick slices of roasted pork that nobody wanted. My parents were completely distracted by the singer on the stage. Without thinking, I reached out with my bare hands, grabbed the buns and the greasy pork, and slid off my chair. I speed-walked over to the adjacent table where I had just seen the men. I crouched down and lifted the edge of the tablecloth, ready to hand them the fresh food. There was nothing there. Just an empty carpet littered with discarded bones and napkins. I checked the next table. Empty. I checked the third one. Nobody. I stood back up, holding these greasy buns in my bare hands, totally confused. I walked back to my seat, and the moment my mom saw me holding the food like a wild animal, she absolutely lost her mind. She ripped into me, quietly screaming about how I was embarrassing the family by hoarding food in my hands, like a glutton. I tried to defend myself. I desperately told her that I was just trying to feed the men who were hiding under the tables eating the bones. Obviously, that sounded completely insane to a rational adult. A group of dirty construction workers hiding under the tables of a luxury wedding without anyone noticing? She told me to shut my mouth and sit still. By the time we were waiting for the final hot pot course to arrive, all the kids at the back tables had gotten restless and ran out to the lobby to play with those little party poppers. I joined them, just happy to escape the stuffy room. Tatum, the chubby rich kid I was playing with earlier, suddenly stopped running and announced he had to go to the bathroom. He asked me to come with him, but I didn't need to go, so I told him to just go by himself. He jogged off down the long, carpeted hallway toward the restrooms, looking ridiculous in his tiny tailored vest and stiff dress pants. About 3 minutes later, Tatum came walking back. He wasn't crying, but his face was scrunched up in deep annoyance. I walked over to him and asked what his deal was. He crossed his arms and complained that he couldn't even pee in peace because some poor construction workers were messing with him. He said they kept poking him and pushing him around while he was at the urinal, and one of them kept pinching his cheeks like an annoying uncle. I looked at his face. Smeared perfectly across his plump cheek was a thick, chalky white handprint. It looked exactly like wet lime plaster. I pointed at it and told him his face was dirty. He just rubbed it, smearing the white dust, and complained that the guy had grabbed him. I asked him which guys he was talking about. He told me to follow him, saying they were doing some kind of repair work right inside the bathroom. We walked down the dimly lit hallway. The restrooms were situated at the very end, about 30 meters away from the noise of the main hall. The smell of strong industrial bleach hit me before we even reached the door. We stood outside the entrance, looking into the men's room. Tatum was just a spoiled kid who didn't understand what he was looking at. He didn't process the reality of the situation, but the moment I looked inside, my blood ran completely cold, and all the innocent pity I felt earlier vanished. The 5 men weren't doing repair work. They were piled up on the cold tile floor in the center of the bathroom. It was this sickening, bloody pile of arms and legs. One man's heavy boots were resting on another man's throat. A head wearing a cracked yellow helmet was slumped over someone else's twisted leg. They were completely heaped on top of each other like discarded mannequins. From a distance, they just looked dirty, but standing only 3 meters away, the reality was horrifying. Their clothes weren't just torn, they were shredded and soaked in thick, dark blood. Their arms and legs were mangled in ways that human bones shouldn't bend. But the absolute worst part was their faces. Earlier, they had smiled at me. They had looked tired, but alive. Now, their faces were contorted in unimaginable agony. Their mouths were hanging open in silent screams, and their eyes were rolled completely back, showing nothing but the dead whites of their eyes. They looked like they were trapped in the exact second of a violent, agonizing death, waiting for an ambulance that was never going to come. Tatum just sighed next to me and said they were probably just taking a nap on the job, which is why he hated poor people. I knew they weren't sleeping. Those were the faces of dead men. Holy fucking shit. Panic finally seized my chest. I turned around and sprinted back to the banquet hall as fast as my little legs could carry me. I crashed into my chair, grabbing my mom's arm and frantically pulling on it. I was hyperventilating, begging her to come to the bathroom to save the men, screaming that they were dying. My parents panicked for a second. They probably thought someone was having a heart attack or getting electrocuted. But then my dad went out, checked the hallway, and obviously found absolutely nothing. When he came back and sat down, my mom was furious. The final hot pot had been served, and we were supposed to eat quickly so we could leave. She grabbed my arm and yanked me back into my chair. I tried to speak, but she smacked me across the arm with a sharp crack, making me jump. She started aggressively shoving food into my mouth. She was literally shoveling hot noodles and meat into my face, telling me to shut up and chew. Eat the fish dipped in fish sauce. Hurry up, she hissed. I was sobbing, trying to push the food out of my mouth so I could warn her. I just kept trying to mumble that the men were hurt. Every time I swallowed enough to open my mouth, she just shoved another spoonful in. While I was chewing frantically, trying to breathe, my eyes locked onto the crack between the open double doors. From my seat, I had a direct line of sight down the hallway leading from the bathroom. They were coming out. The 5 men were emerging from the restroom hallway, walking in a slow, agonizing, single-file line. They were spaced exactly half a meter apart. Their backs were hunched over so far they looked broken. Every step they took seemed to require this massive struggle, like their bodies weighed a ton. The guy in the front was dragging his heavy drill, the metal tip scraping against the marble floor. My mouth was entirely full of food. I was pointing wildly at the door, making these muffled, panicked noises, trying to get my mom to look. She just yelled at me to chew my damn food because it cost them $15, and I wasn't going to waste it. The men slowly turned the corner, heading straight toward the exterior wall of the banquet hall, where our table was located. The closer they got, the harder I hit my mom's arm. Finally, she snapped, turning her head to look exactly where I was pointing. She stared right at the space where the 5 bloodied, ruined men were slowly marching, and she just rolled her eyes, telling me there was nobody there and threatening to beat me when we got home. She couldn't see them, but they were right freaking there. I stopped trying to warn her. I just sat there, my back pressed hard against the chair, watching them get closer. And then, the laws of physics just stopped applying. As the men continued their slow, broken march toward us, their heavy boots stopped making contact with the floor. The guy in the front took a step, but his foot landed on empty air. Then he took another step upward. They were walking up an invisible staircase. With every painful, dragging step, their entire bodies elevated higher off the ground. My mom was still trying to shove food in my face, but my jaw just went slack. A huge glob of half-chewed noodles and meat fell directly out of my mouth and splattered onto my shirt. The ceiling in that part of the ABC building was notoriously low, maybe just a little over 2 meters high. By the time the line of men passed near our doors, their boots were hovering a solid half-meter above the carpet. Because the ceiling was so low, their heads were physically pressed against the plaster above. Their necks were bent at this sickening, unnatural angle to accommodate the ceiling, but they just kept walking. They were gliding right against the wall, their broken bodies floating in the air, their heads scraping against the ceiling tiles with this awful, soft, dragging sound. I couldn't breathe. I grabbed my mom by the waist, and buried my face into her leg, refusing to look anymore. She was screaming at me for spitting out the food and ruining my clothes, complaining that I was hallucinating beggars and ghosts, and swearing she would never take me anywhere again. I didn't care. I just kept my eyes squeezed shut until they finally brought out the dessert course, and people started packing up to leave. When it was time to leave, people were standing up, shaking hands, making their polite goodbyes. I was terrified. I refused to let go of my dad's leg. Normally, I would be running ahead to the escalators, but I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the floor, practically hiding behind his pants as we walked out. We reached the top of the escalator leading down to the first floor. Suddenly, my mom stopped and pointed. She asked out loud why Mr. Quinn's kid was sitting down there acting so weird. I couldn't help it. I peeked my eyes open and looked down the escalator. Tatum was standing at the exact same massive concrete pillar on the first floor where I had seen the men working hours ago. The dead men were nowhere to be seen. It was just Tatum. He was standing completely still, facing the rough concrete surface. He had both of his bare, soft hands pressed flat against the pillar, and he was frantically scrubbing his palms up and down against the abrasive concrete, mimicking the exact motion of a worker sanding a wall. It was violent. He was scrubbing so hard and so fast that I could clearly hear the wet, tearing sound of his skin separating from his flesh, going back and forth, scraping wetly against the stone. His hands had to be bleeding, but his face was completely blank. My parents reached the bottom of the escalator and walked right up to him. My dad asked him what he was doing and where his parents were. Tatum didn't even blink. He didn't respond. He just kept violently shredding his palms against the concrete pillar. Even as a kid, I knew exactly what was happening. I knew those dead men had gotten into his head. I started pulling on my mom's shirt, crying and begging them to just leave, to get us out of there. My dad stood there for a minute watching this kid bleed onto the wall, and then he just sighed. "Leave him be. Let the security guards catch him," he muttered. We just left him there, scraping his skin off, while my parents hurried to the parking lot to beat the traffic. A few years later, my aunt's kid went to another wedding at that exact same venue and saw the 5 dead workers too. That was the moment my mom finally realized I wasn't making crap up. All those dark rumors eventually killed the restaurant's business, and it shut down around 2012. But those 5 guys, they never left. After the restaurant closed, the building management repurposed that entire floor into a bunch of normal food stalls, selling everything from sweet soup and dim sum to hot pot and buffets. I don't want to ruin anyone's business, honestly. The people working there now are innocent, and it's a decent place. If that apartment complex had been built on any other piece of land, it probably would have thrived, but it wasn't. And the messed up thing? It seems like these 5 dead workers specifically target kids. Even now, in the present day, my wife and I actually still go there every month or two to grab food. Just sitting there, knowing those 5 are probably still pacing around the columns right behind the oblivious customers. It just makes my skin crawl.